hello there, I'm Kaz. You know, summer's here, there's such beautiful weather outside, blockbusters are coming out week by week. So, what better way to spend it than to sit around and play video games? Hey to Brian Adams. Now, I'll be going over Final Fantasy IV for the DS, and before you leave that comment, yes, I am aware of the various changes that were made to this version of Final Fantasy, as well as the other ports, which we'll be getting to briefly, but for now, lest ye enter. This be the summer of Square Enix. Final Fantasy IV. While certainly an important chapter in the series, it's also one that's been undermined by another 16-bit Final Fantasy, and the fact that it's become the most remade Final Fantasy, with the exception of the first one. It was an innovator for its time, but does it still hold up? The short answer? Yes. How come? Well, let's begin from what an RPG should get right, the narrative. The story is one of love and loss, revenge and forgiveness, self-discovery and redemption. A dark knight named Cecil is sent by his king to deliver a ring with his childhood friend and rival, Dragoon Kane, unbeknownst of the ruler's intentions. From there, the plot unfolds with Cecil saying farewell to his bloodstained past and redeeming himself for his past actions by saving the world from the malicious Golbez. Or, so it seems. Unlike many of the other RPGs and even Final Fantasy games before, characters were fleshed out, they were given detailed backstories, many characters you'd grow to love would die permanently, and there were massive plot twists throughout the adventure that always kept you hooked. There was no RPG before it, or for that matter, any game that told a story on this grand of a scale. The original translation wasn't the best, but many of these goofs are remembered fondly by fans. You spoony Bard indeed. In the DS remake, there were some scenes added in, but they're few and far between, and they don't really leave a bigger impact. Personally, I think the story would have worked better just fine without these minor details, but the updated dialogue is appreciated. The base of 4's story and the emotional power of the narrative still hold up well, as one of Square's finest moments in storytelling, despite the changes. Though, speaking of which, let's look over a few of them, shall we?
So, you did survive. Impressive.
Jay, what in the world's gotten into you?
The DS version wasn't the first time that Square Enix had made changes to this game. Starting with the American release of Final Fantasy IV, a few passages were removed and some character abilities were tweaked. For example, Cecil's Dark Wave ability was removed in the Western release, but was restored in many of the later versions. In the DS version, it's replaced by the Soul Eater ability from the Dark Knight class in the Japanese version of Final Fantasy III. Confused? In the PlayStation 1 port, they added a new CG opening that, for the time, looked good, but compared to the DS's gorgeous opening, looks completely outdated. Both the Game Boy Advance and PSP versions included a bonus dungeon called the Luna Ruins. The DS version includes quite a few changes, like the auto battle mode, which makes grinding much simpler and less of a chore. You could watch a movie while the auto battle is on, or if you're like me with your two DS's, you can put Final Fantasy IV in one and grind in that, and on the other, you can play a different Square Enix game. There's other additions like the Summon Wit, which you can train with your party members in various minigames. Fat Chocobos now serve as the extras with music, a bestiary, and cutscenes. Speaking of cutscenes, there's now voice acting too. It's pretty cheesy, but you're given the option to turn it off if you don't like it.
Then let me show you how wrong you are!
The biggest change from a gameplay perspective, however, is that throughout Final Fantasy IV, you'll come across items that will give you permanent abilities. For example, you can give Cecil the counter ability, which works great with his cover ability. Mixing and matching all the abilities you can get works incredibly well. If you're clever enough, you can even make Bard Song useful. Naming Way can no longer change your name. When you fill out the map on the bottom screen, you can get more items. and some of the boss's strategies, such as the antlion, have been tweaked, so longtime fans who think that they can just use magic over and over again are in for a shock. Aside from that, there's no other significant changes that should be mentioned. There's a few minor ones here and there, but what made the game so great in 1991 is still intact here. All these changes are for the better, as they better the experience and make it much more accessible. Now on the surface, Final Fantasy IV may not seem like the game changer it was for RPGs, but back then it contained one of the most vast worlds with 3 levels: the surface, the underground, and the moon. It had a massive amount of dungeons to explore, as well as a ton of bonuses. The true innovation of Final Fantasy IV, however, came from the battle system. Instead of taking turns, a small meter will fill up as time goes by. Once it fills up, your character can choose what to do with their move: healing, items, attacking, or a special ability, like Kane's jump. Speaking of battle, combat has up to 5 party members, unlike the previous remake of Final Fantasy III, which only housed 4. Because of this, combat feels more fast-paced than it was before. Monsters won't wait for you to think of your next move. You have to think of the best strategy to keep battle short and minimize damage and the items that you use. There's also a mode that lets time run or stop whenever you execute an action, so that makes the game more suited to the challenge the player wants. Speaking of which, the game is more in tone with the challenge of the original Japanese version. You never have to tediously grind to get the upper hand, but it'll definitely help out with some of the later battles. Save points are plentiful, and as long as you're not healing every time you get injured, you should be able to cast any variation of cure without any fear of running low on magic points. There's also a New Game Plus mode, which lets you keep any of the abilities a character may have earned, and certain items you've obtained in a previous save, which definitely makes the game a more fair challenge that rewards you for persevering through it without making the game too easy. And trust me, you'll want to play through this one till the end. It's one of the few games where I can't really think of any flaws. I guess some of the bosses can be a bit too challenging on the first try, but once you get their pattern down, you'll know how to beat them. In short, even after 20 years, Final Fantasy IV is just as enjoyable as it was in 1991. Now, normally this is the part where I discuss the graphics and the presentation, but to be quite honest, the many versions of Final Fantasy IV, with the exception of the DS version, all look the same. The only difference is that some look a little bit more colorful than others. 4 had decent battle sprites and impressive spells, but the overhead view is little more than a more vibrant NES game, which makes sense since it did start out as an NES title. In fact, I never thought that the Final Fantasy games had graphics to write home about until I saw Final Fantasy VI. Even Final Fantasy VII, as beloved as it is, let's be honest, it certainly isn't an eye-pleaser. Just look at Cloud's arms, they look ridiculous. The DS remake, however, gave 4 a huge facelift. Not only did the graphics change dimensions, but it changed for the better. It's a beautiful game, with some of the finest graphics on the system. Full motion videos of the summons look great, and spells look much flashier and more powerful than before. Now, some have criticized this remake for the characters deviating from their original art design, but to be fair, I think this is because Final Fantasy IV was originally designed for the NES, but was changed to the Super Nintendo, and as such was limited to the amount of detail and graphics. Without much expression from the characters, the art design was the best representation of what the characters would look like. Either way, the characters still look great, and it's easily among the best looking 3D games on the DS. The highlight of the presentation, however, is the score. On the Super Nintendo, the soundtrack was one of the first examples of the talents of Nobuo Uematsu. While writing this, I checked out some of the other versions of the soundtrack, including tracks from CDs like the Celtic Moon, and all of them had the same fine melody, just with a different take. Sound effects for attack and magic are all good, but the music is the standout part of the presentation. Every track is so memorable, from Edward's theme, to Golbez's haunting organ, to the Archfiend's climactic battles. It's not just one of the best soundtracks in the series' history, it's one of the best soundtracks ever made. Final Fantasy IV for the DS easily has one of the best presentations on the system. Final Fantasy IV, while not what I consider the best in the series, is my favorite out of the ones I've played so far. And one of the best things about it is that it's been released for so many systems, so there's no excuse not to get it. Final Fantasy IV has been released for the Super Nintendo, PlayStation, Game Boy Advance, Wii Virtual Console, PlayStation Portable, and of course, the Nintendo DS. Now, this DS remake was made for Final Fantasy's 20th anniversary, and, at least in Japan, it's been out for 5 years. So, tune in next time, where we find out what Square Enix has planned for its 25th anniversary of this fantastic series. Until next time, game on, my friends. Oh, by the way, this is just a final reminder. During the summer of Square Enix, I'll be covering games new and old, so if there's any games that you would like me to do, please, write it down in the comments. I'd love to hear what you want me to do. I've got a few games planned out already, but if there's a week or two that I need to fill in, maybe there's a game that I could fill in that you would want me to do. So, until next time, once again, game on, my friends.